This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, good afternoon, good morning, everybody. My name is Rob Willis and I use the pronouns he, him. I'm today's moderator facilitator, and along with my colleague Janelle Roberts, we are the contractors supporting this roundtable. Please note that this meeting is being live streamed and recorded, and we will also be saving the chat following the meeting. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us if there's anything we can do to support your participation. I want to immediately turn it over to Sylvia Quast. She is a senior advisor to the EPA's Office of Water Assistant Administrator, Radhika Fox. Sylvia.
Great. Thank you so much, Rob, and good afternoon to everyone. And thank you so much for taking the time to join us today for this important regional roundtable on implementation of the term Waters of the United States in the Clean Water Act. This is our Northeast-focused roundtable, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing the conversation. As you just heard from Rob, my name is Sylvia Quast. I'm a senior advisor to Radhika Fox, the Assistant Administrator for the Office of Water here at EPA, and on behalf of both Radhika and Administrator Regan, I'm very excited to be here in this roundtable with you, and I'm looking forward very much to hearing what you have to say. As some of you may be aware, this year we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. This milestone offers us an opportunity to take stock of the incredible progress we have made over the past 50 years. And it's also a great time to assess ways to sustain that progress. While rivers in this fire no longer catch fire, thank God, new challenges continue to emerge, then there are some old challenges that have persisted through the years. Waters of the United States remains a critical issue, as I'm sure I don't need to tell anyone on this roundtable. The definition of WOTUS is fundamental to the Clean Water Act and central to continuing to ensure clean and safe water that we all rely on. Given the importance and high level of interest on this topic, EPA and the Army have committed to conducting extensive outreach with stakeholders and our co-regulators. The fact is, our country's water resources are incredibly diverse, as are the experiences and perspectives of those who are affected by the application of this term on the ground. So it's important that the agencies understand those experiences and perspectives. Today's roundtable and the other 9 that have happened or will be happening over the next week are one part of this effort. Rather than talking at you, our goal for today is to hear from you. That was why we asked you to choose the discussion topics you wanted to focus on for today's roundtable. This has been our approach for these roundtables because we fully recognize that different regions have different concerns, and we want to get a better sense of those different concerns. One thing I should note here is that last fall, we proposed a rule about the definition of waters of the United States. The public comment period on that proposal closed on February 7th, and we are reviewing the comments that we received, well over 100,000. Although we can't consider any new information provided here today as part of that process, we look forward to hearing your feedback and experiences with how we have implemented that term so that we can do a better job of making sure we all have access to clean water going forward. I want to thank everyone on the roundtable, and especially the good folks at Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, for not only taking the time to develop a well thought out and diverse nomination, but for helping develop the agenda and being here today. I know it wasn't easy to coordinate. I have no doubt that this will be an incredibly valuable conversation. So for the sake of time, I'm going to turn it over to Stacy Jensen with the Army. Stacy, please take it away.
Thanks, Sylvia. On behalf of Assistant Secretary Connor, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. My name is Stacy Jensen. I'm the Assistant for Regulatory and Tribal Affairs for the Assistant Secretary. Our office provides oversight and policy direction for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Civil Works Program. The Army recognizes the importance and value of our nation's water resources, and we join EPA in this effort to hear from you and understand your experiences and perspectives related to the definition of waters of the U.S. And the Army is particularly interested in gaining a better understanding of ways to ensure implementation of the definition is clear and with the appropriate level of consideration for regional differences. In addition, we're interested in understanding any tools that may exist that may help with better implementing the definition. The Corps is one of the primary agents of Clean Water Act implementation, as they engage with co-regulators of states, tribes, local governments, as well as the landowners and stakeholders on a daily basis. So as a result, we know firsthand how important open communication is to implementing the Clean Water Act. And we look forward to hearing your input on the topics you've chosen for today's roundtable. Thank you.
Great. Stacy, Sylvia, thank you. I'm going to spend 3 minutes or less here briefly orienting you to Zoom and then talking about how we plan to use Zoom for the meeting. Then we're going to be jumping right into the meeting. The first thing I want to do, though, is I want to recognize that virtual meetings, they present an indescribable number of ways to go sideways. So if you start talking while you're on mute or unmuted and something happens, like dog barking in the background, a bad internet connection, a spousal intervention, no big deal. We've all experienced that, and it's totally okay. That being said, we do try to minimize distraction loops. And to do that, I ask that you keep yourself on mute. Up there on the screen, you should see the Zoom meeting panel. And that has all of the icons that allow you to control your Zoom meeting experience. Sometimes that Zoom meeting panel disappears, and if so, all you have to do is move your mouse somewhere over the Zoom and that meeting panel should appear. If you're joining on your phone or some other device, it may not look like the Zoom panel like it is up there on the screen. However, all of the icons should remain the same. So to keep yourself muted, you can press the number 1 button there, which is the mute button. When there's a red line through that button, it indicates that you are muted. You can toggle your video on and off by pressing the video button labeled number 2. The third button is the participant icon. If you press that button, it'll pop up a separate dialog box that has the names of all of the individuals that are in the meeting. Fourth button is the chat button. I have the chat enabled to allow you to chat to one another and also to send us messages. If there's anything that we can do to support your participation, please don't hesitate to send me or Janelle a chat. And please note that the chat is going to be saved following the call. If having captions in English is desired, you can press the live transcript button labeled number 5 there. A sub menu will appear and you can choose show subtitle. If you have subtitles showing and you want to get rid of the subtitles, you can press that live transcript button and then you can hit hide subtitles. Last is button number 6, a reactions button. I'm going to be using the raise hand feature to help manage the conversation. You can raise your hand in 2 ways. You can hit Alt-Y if you're a keyboard shortcut person. Again, Alt-Y will raise and lower your hand, or you can press that reactions button and raise hand, and that will show up on my screen indicating, like Dan just did, that he wants to jump into the conversation. So thank you, Dan, for doing that and practicing that. I appreciate that very much. I've got one last request, and that is primarily for my purpose, which is renaming yourself in Zoom so I'm able to call you by your name and also have a sense of what organization you're with. To do that, you want to click button, the participants button that will generate the panel, participants panel, hover over your name, click more. Another dialog box will appear in the text field. Go ahead and put your name, your personal pronouns if desired, and your organization. So I'm going to give folks 20 seconds to do that. Okay, so how are we going to spend our time together today? Well, I'm glad you asked. Up on the screen is our agenda. We are going to start with basically going around the horn here and asking folks to introduce themselves and offer some initial reflections on a discussion question. In the chat, I put the order of the introductions so as not to be surprised. Then we've got 3 discussion blocks. Those are going to be more organic, so I'm going to be asking folks to raise their hand and jump into the conversation. In working with John, he identified a couple of individuals to get those conversations started. And we've got a discussion block on regionally specific water bodies, a discussion block on climate change impacts, and a discussion block on jurisdictional determinations. So we're going to get right to the introductions. So up there on the screen, you'll see the couple of questions that we're asking you to reflect on, and I'm asking that you keep your introduction to about 3 minutes or less. So the first person on my list is John. John, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Terrific. Thanks, Rob. I'm John Devine. I'm the Director of Federal Water Policy at the Natural Resources Defense Council. I'm here today because I helped organize this roundtable and because I have worked on the Clean Water Act and specifically on waters of the U.S. For almost 17 years. But I really want to thank my fellow panelists for participating today, especially those of you who, for whom this is not your full-time job. I know it is a sacrifice to take time out of your day to do this, so thank you very much. In terms of the question about that we posed about the health of water bodies in our community, I currently reside in Arlington, Virginia, which is a highly developed area. The main surface water in my neighborhood, 4 Mile Run, is a tributary to the Potomac River, and its water quality and potential to flood our community is linked to the few remaining wetlands and to the many small rain-fed and even buried streams in the vicinity. But I recognize that Virginia isn't in the Northeast region that you've defined, so I'll have to go a little further back in time. My more relevant experience is growing up on the South Shore of Massachusetts, where my parents still live. I remember not being able to dig clams with my dad when we had red tides. But I also remember that since the adoption of the Clean Water Act, I've seen the Charles River and Boston Harbor transformed from being punchlines about polluted water to being treasured community assets. And so I know how important the Clean Water Act is to communities' well-being and their economies. And again, thank you for the opportunity to be here.
John, thank you. I've got Drew next, and following Drew, I've got Steve. Drew, please jump in.
Sure, thanks. I'm Drew Smith. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Rodale Institute. I know a lot of people probably maybe not heard of Rodale Institute, even though we've been around for over 70 years. But we're a research and education institute, nonprofit that works mostly in organic agriculture. So the term organic was popularized by our founder, J.I. Rodale, when he started Organic Gardening and Farming magazine. And his son, Bob, was highly influential in getting the USDA National Organic Program that we now recognize. So we've been working in organic agriculture. And so obviously the touch points for us are largely around pollutants like pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, synthetic fertilizers, mostly nitrogen and phosphorus that are entering our water, as well as sediment that can run off. And while we've looked around at some of the projects that we have, and while the Northeast is highly populated, when we look at the watersheds we work in, we recognize that agriculture and working lands are the dominant land use in those areas. And just about anything you put on an agricultural field moves. It goes either down into a stream, in the water, or in the air. So we think it's a critical part of research for us. And part of my work, I oversee our research as well as our farm operations. We're located in Kutztown, Pennsylvania, about 2 hours from New York City and Philadelphia. But we consider ourselves a global organization working in regenerative organic agriculture. And I think a lot of these themes would resonate in a lot of parts of the country and world. So thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Drew, thank you. I've got Steve and Lori. Steve, jump in.
Hi, I'm Steve Mills, pronouns he, him. I'm the CEO of Freeport, Maine-based Maine Beer Company. We've been around since 2009, and our purpose is to do a lot of good through great beer. And what that means for us is we donate 1% of our gross annual sales to environmental nonprofits, try to be a good employer, a good teammate for our teams. Everyone here makes a competitive wage, at least $20 an hour. Everyone here accumulates PTO. Full-timer, you're going to get 3+ weeks right out of that, and contribute 5% to their 401k. Do our best to be a good employer. Supporting those environmental nonprofits, we do that through 1% of the planet, and then we have guests come in and they leave donations as well. And by the end of this year, from 2009 till the end of 2022, our combined giving is going to total, should total over $2 million. So I'm here today because, we're a member of a coastal community. We're essentially surrounded by water. And as a member of this community, we have a lot of heritage industries such as fishing and farming and forestry, and our neighbors who've spent, the majority of their lives in those industries. They've seen changes in the last 10 years that they've never seen before. And they're concerned. Secondly, as a brewery, and every brewery that I know, about 90% of our finished product is water. And the rest of it is essentially an agricultural product. So without clean, consistent water supply, it jeopardizes the 490,000+ brewing jobs in the United States and jeopardizes the annual economic impact that brewing has on the U.S., which exceeded $76 billion last year. That's with a B. So for us, the health of water bodies in our area, well, I have to say, right, the Clean Water Act, 1972, congratulations on 50 years. Senator Muskie of the great state of Maine had a little bit of something to do with that. And it's definitely improved the water quality throughout the U.S., and that's already been mentioned before. But healthy water is necessary to preserve the livelihoods of my town's culture and history. And so any threat to that is definitely top of mind. So things like responsible water access, benefits of carbon sequestration, natural water filtration, through deacidification, through like aquaculture, being mindful of forever chemicals, where our runoff goes, they're all a focus in our community. And we can use all the help we can get.
Steve, thank you so much. Appreciate it. I've got Lori and then Sherry. Lori.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me here. I am currently the Chief of Natural Resources in the Bureau of Water Supply for the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. And prior to that, I headed up the Bureau of Water Supply's Wetlands Protection Program since 1998 to 2020. So 22 years working with wetlands for the Bureau of Water Supply's interests. So the mission of the Bureau and I've been following and working with the city's attorneys and following the WOTUS issue since early in my career, since the Swank decision came down when I was just really getting started in my career with New York City. The mission of the Bureau of Water Supply is to sustainably deliver high quality drinking water to the city of New York to promote the public health, economic development, and the quality of life in New York City. You may have heard a lot about the city's water supply. It's a very interesting system. The city gets its water from about 2,000 square mile watershed located in portions of the Hudson Valley and the Catskill Mountains. And this watershed provides over 1 billion gallons of safe water every day to 8.8 million residents of the city, and also to an additional 1 million upstate consumers. So this water supply really amounts to providing clean water for about half of New York State's population. This is a surface water supply. It's fed by the overland flow into the streams and rivers and reservoirs, and its sustainability clearly relies on the conditions of water resources, such as wetlands and streams in this watershed. Roughly 90% of the water supply that the city uses originates in the Catskill Mountains and is currently of such high quality that it does not require filtration. So to maintain our status as one of 5 large cities in the US that is supplied by surface waters that are clean enough to be exempt from filtration requirements, we implement numerous programs to conserve watershed lands, protect wetlands, upgrade wastewater infrastructure, and implement strategies on watershed farms and manage critical natural resources like forests and our wetlands. But in addition to these programs that we have in place, the regulations of other agencies, such as the Corps and the EPA, are important for helping to protect this critical water supply. Roughly 60% of the lands in our system are privately owned. And that includes about 70% of the 35,000 acres of wetlands that we estimate in the watershed. So those are on private lands that we don't necessarily, but that we don't have control of. In addition to this, another reason that we rely on federal regs is the New York State freshwater wetland law, as many of you are probably aware, currently only applies to wetlands that are at least 12.4 acres in size. And so that excludes just about 70% of the wetlands that we've mapped in that unfiltered portion of the watershed. And the state just did pass some legislation that will reduce that minimum threshold to 7.4 acres in 2028. But I did a quick look at our NWI and found that roughly 54% of the wetlands in that unfiltered portion of our watershed will still remain outside of state regulation. So given the critical roles that we know that wetlands and streams play in protecting the quantity and the quality of surface waters, the city has for a long time supported a broad and science-based definition of WOTUS of the US, and such an approach where we continue to consider the science will support our mission to ensure a safe and sustainable water supply for nearly half the state's population. And this also potentially helps us, the city, avoid an estimated $10 billion is what it would cost to build a filtration plant. So we are often touted as sort of a worldwide example of demonstrating the role of ecosystem services, where we can see clearly here the benefits of natural resource protection and inversely the potential cost of failing to do so. So that's basically where I'm coming from. Thank you.
Great. Lori, thank you. Next I have Sherry, and then after Sherry, I'm going to go to Gabriella. Sherry, please.
Thank you. My name is Sherry Venno. I work as an environmental planner for the Holton Band of Maliseet Indians, a federally recognized tribe of 1,935 tribal citizens, and I am here speaking on their behalf. John Devine contacted me after reading formal written comments that we submitted to EPA that ask for a broad, inclusive, and scientifically based definition of WOTUS. This panel discussion allows us to share a little more depth why an inclusive and scientifically based definition is critically important to us. Here I'm about to read a quote from Chief Clarissa Sabatis, and I apologize for not doing justice to the several Maliseet words that I will be attempting as I read. The Holton Band of Maliseet Indians, or Mitak-Sonagawiak, is one of 8 Wolastoqey or Maliseet First Nations who continue to inhabit our traditional territory of the Wolastic St. John watershed. This area includes the northeastern portion of Maine into New Brunswick, Canada. Our ancestors have inhabited the land along these rivers and waterways from time immemorial. Being a riverine people, the water has always been at the center of our existence, from sustenance to ceremony. There is a word in our language, and it's pronounced Ntolabemuk. It means all my relations. This watershed and these rivers within it are more than just things to use up. They are our relatives. The earth clans, four-legged, air clan, and water clans are Samaquanawijik. Water is sacred. It is our duty to be stewards of these lands, these waters, and all of our relations that inhabit it. Today, we rarely see the traditional seafaring fish that were so important to our survival, like salmon. Despite increasing issues with water quality, our people continue to rely on rivers for sustenance. Due to substances like DDT and mercury in our waters, it is not safe to consume the amounts of fish that generations before us could. In the Meduxnikeg, the current guidance recommends no more than 2 fish meals per month, so you can see where this might be a problem. Water quality, again, stretches beyond just us, but to our eagle populations, which is sacred to us. We have tasked our Natural Resources Department with restoring the salmon and eagle populations, and through our work to improve water quality, have seen positive qualitative results. We not only have a pair of eagles that live along our river, but each year we are observing multiple juvenile eagles at various stages. I believe that this is a direct result of a healthier river. While the methods we use are far from traditional, it remains our responsibility to adapt and overcome obstacles to restore the ecosystems in our traditional lands to improve the livelihood of all that inhabit them. Words of Chief Clarissa Sabatis. Thank you.
Great. Sherry, thank you. Gabriella, I have you next, and then Anne, I'm coming to you. Gabriella?
Okay, thank you. And my apologies for being late. My name is Gabriella Velarde Ward, and I live on Graniteville, in Graniteville, Staten Island, New York City. I've been an artist, photographer, architectural designer, construction supervisor, and have been an ordained priest for 14 years. As part of my architectural degree, I studied architectural, landscape and sustainable design and ecology and urban planning. I was a member of the Pratt Board of Trustees for 2 years. I worked for the New York City Park Department for 23 years as a designer and construction supervisor. I represented the Parks Department to the Mayor's Office of Construction for Sustainable Construction. We were formulating policy, which led to LEED. And it was citywide, requiring large projects to incorporate sustainable design and construction. I supervised construction at Midland Beach before, during, and after Hurricane Sandy, where 24 plus people died during Hurricane Sandy, which was a storm surge on Staten Island. Half the people that died in New York City died there. Because this kind of tragedy should never happen again, in 2017, I co-founded the Coalition for Wetlands and Forests, and I've been leading it ever since. Our purpose was to prevent the destruction of the Graniteville Forest, freshwater forested wetland, which saved us from flooding during Hurricane Sandy. I knew and had been saying for 4 years that if we lose this wetland, we will be flooded. And Graniteville was flooded after 4 years of working all the systems, lawsuits, webinars, organized community, and all kinds of other things. Last summer, the forest was cut down. And by August 31st, 80% of the wetland had been destroyed, and on August 1st, we were flooded, just as I had said. We're still fighting to protect this EJ community and the mobile home community next to it. The residents in the mobile home community are elderly, disabled, and low income, but we're not giving up. Even though the trees are gone, we're not giving up because it's really a dangerous precedent. What brought me here, the plan is to create a BJ's, a shopping center, including a gas station and parking lot for 835 cars in a wetland. And I'm hoping to spread this information as far and wide as possible. In this age of climate change, this should never have happened, a gas station in a wetland. And we're surrounded by 3 very large bodies of water. This one was a vernal pool forested wetland. One of the pools is WOTUS, which supplies water to the tidal wetland, which is also WOTUS, and that flows into Arthur Kill, a water between the 2 states, which is also WOTUS, and they have a gas station right next to it. If we're talking about pollution of the waters of the United States, this project with its gas station and its 835 car parking lot, there'll be great threat of pollution to the bodies of water and to the community. Thank you.
Gabriella, thank you. I've got Anne and Denise. Anne?
Hold on one second. Hi, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're coming through loud and clear, Anne. Welcome.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here with all of you today. And I appreciate the opportunity. So my name is Anne Hulick. I'm the Connecticut Director of Clean Water Action, which is, many of you may know, is a national environmental nonprofit organization. And we are celebrating our 50th anniversary this year, as we were one of the key groups leading the effort to get the Clean Water Act passed. And we've continued to work on making sure that the law is fully implemented to its original intent as much as we can. And we appreciate the partnership with all of you. So I just wanted to share a little bit. I started out my career as a nurse and worked for 20 plus years, 21 years in critical care. And I loved it, but I was always very concerned, even from a very young age, about our impacts to the environment and how that harms health and harms the ecosystem. And while I loved my career as a nurse and felt like we did a great job taking care of people when they're sick, I was always frustrated that we didn't do enough as healthcare professionals, frankly, to recognize the links between our actions on the environment and health. And so mid-career, later in my career, later in midlife, I decided to take a leap of faith and try to figure out how to get into policy work to help promote policies and advocate for policies that protect our environment and protect health. So I was fortunate enough I went to law school, and I was fortunate enough to land after that at Clean Water Action, where I have the privilege of working with so many experts who actually suggested that I might participate in this panel today. So I live in Connecticut. We're a pretty small state, but I live just south of Hartford, right along the Connecticut River in Cromwell, Connecticut, and work across the state. And I've been increasingly concerned, and my organization has been increasingly concerned about the health of our water bodies in Connecticut, despite the fact that we have some pretty strong state laws. We have a state water plan. We have abundant sources of water for drinking water and recreation and wildlife habitat. But we've seen so many changes over the last several years that are increasingly concerning about our waters and assuring that we are protecting them for future generations. We have, as I said, abundant sources of drinking water, safe drinking water, but the more that we're seeing changes to our climate, such as intense frequent storms and more extreme, longer periods of heat, we're seeing changes to those water bodies, both to our iconic rivers like Connecticut River and the Farmington River, but also impacts to Long Island Sound. All of these are greatly impact Connecticut's economy because people are drawn to the state for the beautiful waterways and rivers and the sound where people recreate and go for vacations and fish and swim. So it is a major concern, some of these changes that we're seeing. One example of some of the water pollution that I'm also very concerned about is toxic chemical pollution. And we had an extreme event of AFFF firefighting foam contaminating the Farmington River in 2019. We also have pollution from nitrogen fertilizers, microplastics, road salt that not only run into our riverways, but end up in Long Island Sound. So all of these concerns are the reasons that I'm particularly concerned, and my organization is concerned about making sure we have a strong, scientifically based WOTUS rule that clearly defines the jurisdiction of these waters that are so critical to all of us, to our health and to our planet. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Anne. I've got Denise, then Rabbi Cardin. Denise?
Thank you. And good afternoon. My name is Denise Savageau, and I live in Old Lyme, Connecticut. And I grew up in a lakeside community in Central Mass, where I developed a passion for all things water as a kid. So it's no surprise that I've worked for the past 35 years in soil and water conservation. I started my professional career with the Hartford County Soil and Water Conservation District in Connecticut and was co-located with USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, providing technical assistance and education to farmers, municipalities, and landowners, and coordinating watershed management programs throughout the county. As part of this work, I was involved statewide in assisting with towns with wetlands protection and the implementation of Connecticut's Inland Wetlands and Watercourses Act, which, by the way, is also celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, along with the Clean Water Act, and Section 404, obviously, of the Clean Water Act when we were looking at wetland protection. In 1997, I became the conservation director for a local municipality. And I think most of us know that that's where the rubber meets the road at local municipalities. And this was in southwestern Connecticut. And I worked there on watershed management, drinking water supply, source water protection, and Long Island Sound, where I supported our local shellfish commission, and I operated a diadromous fishway. So I've looked at water from all different aspects. I also worked in the local emergency operations center during Superstorm Sandy. So I understand that role of water as well. And although I retired from the town in 2018, I currently serve as the chair of the Connecticut Council on Soil and Water Conservation and as president of the Connecticut Association of Conservation District. I also serve in Connecticut's Water Planning Council Advisory Group, the State Water Plan Implementation Work Group, Connecticut Source Water Collaborative, and the Long Island Sound Citizens Advisory Group. And it's through all of these organizations, and one of the reasons I'm here is that I see all of the water connected. Connecticut is a small state, 3 million people on 3 million acres, and very intensive land use. Water is critical for drinking water supply, for food supply. A lot of times we talk about agriculture like it's an industry, but it's not just an industry, it's our food supply. As well as, water is critical for protecting our robust aquaculture industry in Long Island Sound, and for business and industries and for recreation. So you got 3 million people, you need water for all phases of everything we do in our life. We're having challenges related to land use and the conversion of fields and forests to impervious cover. And in Connecticut, and most people don't think about in the Northeast, we have a quantity issue, not just a quality issue. And the relationship between quantity and quality should not be underestimated. When you have low flows in stream, you have algal blooms and you have other challenges with the water quality. So we really need to be paying attention to this, especially given the challenges of climate change. We've come a long way in the past 50 years since the passage of the Clean Water Act, but there is still a lot of work to do, and particularly educating people about water. Michigan State University just came out with a study that shows that the public does not understand the connection between forests and clean water. So how do we make sure that they understand that? The uplands in clean water, the riparian zones, the wetlands. How do they make sure that they understand those connections? And I can tell you firsthand that most folks, including many in the environmental field, do not understand the relationship between healthy soil and clean, abundant water. We now need to focus on protecting ecosystem services, as my colleague from New York said, those ecosystem services provided by our natural and working lands that protect our water resources. And we need to think about water from a perspective of one water. It is all one water, whether we are talking about drinking water supplies or groundwater or protecting our nation's estuaries. It is all one water, and we need to treat it accordingly. And that's why I'm here. Thank you.
Great. Denise, thank you. I've got Rabbi Carden, then Dan, then Jim. Rabbi Carden, please.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to be here. I am Nina Beth Carden. I am a rabbi living in Baltimore, Maryland, and I am the exact opposite of people like Denise and others here who are experts in water system and WOTUS and the 50 years of its anniversary of its existence. But I am here because I am very concerned, as many, many people in the faith community and the general community, about the quality of our water. I was founder and chair of the Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake here in the Chesapeake Bay watershed area. It is an organization that incorporates hundreds of congregations that are interested in the quality of the water. As one of our founders said, water is the pool at the bottom of the hill. We know, as Denise and others were saying, that in fact water both contributes to the health of the environment, but the environment also contributes to the health of the water. And there are thousands and thousands of congregations that are very interested in the way that their buildings and their land impact the water, in part because water for so many religious communities is considered sacred. It is used in sacred ceremonies. It is part of the founding myths of how we became an earth, a people, how creation was made. And so water is so central to the way that faith people imagine their calling here on earth and their responsibility to take care of the world. So water is central to them. I'm also part of the board of the Waterkeepers Chesapeake, which is an organization, again, throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed area, with waterkeepers caring for the waters in their communities. And I'm the director of the Maryland Campaign for Environmental Human Rights, which incorporates water in that we believe that there should be placed in our Constitution in the state of Maryland, an amendment that says everyone has a right to a healthful environment, so that we can use that fundamental right as a way to prevent some of the degradations that we're hearing about now from happening, and also to reverse some of the past degradations that have happened. Personally, I live one house away from a stream that feeds into the Jones Falls here in the Jones Falls watershed, which leads into the Chesapeake Bay. In this area of Maryland, you're a hop, skip, and a jump away from a stream. Some of the streams are daylighted, some of the streams are buried. Many people don't understand the impact, as we were hearing before, between what they're doing on their land, on their lawns, on their yards, and the quality of the water. I think that one of the things that we can do, and people in the faith community can do, can help educate people as to how their own use of their land and their yards and what they plant on there, the pesticides that they use, the insecticides that they use, the fertilizers that they use, how that in fact affects the waters that are in their community. And you can't be in Baltimore without being impacted by the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay is a central environmental but also economic driver of our region. And we know that we are all responsible for making sure that the Bay is well protected and preserved. It is what our watermen rely on, is what our recreation and tourism relies on, is what our people who like the seafood and the oysters and the crabs rely on. And we know that we are responsible for the well-being of the Bay, and that it starts in part with the awareness of our congregants, our neighbors, our businesses, and the businesses that we will patronize, to make sure that they take care of the Bay as well. And in addition, we understand that there are major issues with development. Just today and yesterday, people have been calling and writing to me about some development processes that are being undertaken in their own counties around the state that impact the wetlands and water bodies in inappropriate ways. And they don't have the legal resources to stop them. We have a problem with Conowingo Dam, which was just given another 50 years of permit to be operating, when in fact we know that the sediment that has been accumulating there for decades is in danger of being washed downstream, especially with increased water rain instances that are accompanying because of climate change. So there are so many things that just ordinary people like me who are somewhat engaged are very concerned about. And I also am here to remind you that the faith community is a huge resource for you to utilize, to be able to get out the word of how we can best protect the water sources all around us. So thank you very much for inviting me.
Great. Thank you. I've got Dan, then Jim, then Dominique. Dan, please.
Thank you. This is Dan Shapley. I am a program director working on water quality issues for Hudson Riverkeeper. We're an organization that's been around just a little bit longer than the Clean Water Act, dedicated to protecting and restoring the Hudson, its tributaries, and our region's drinking water supplies here in New York. Now, WOTUS really is part of watershed protection, and that it's not going to do anything on its own. Like a lot of these laws, we need all of them working in concert together to get to the protection we need at a watershed scale that achieves the goals of swimmable, drinkable, and fishable that were established with the Clean Water Act. Here in my area, the things I want to talk about really start where Lori started, with New York City's drinking water supply. As she said, it serves almost 10 million people, about half the population of New York State. And critical to this protection is that network of state, federal, and local laws that allow a city way downstream to protect its drinking water supply far upstream, where our laws in New York State naturally give it no power to assert any authority. Most communities do not benefit from this level of protection because of home rule. The downstream community doesn't have any authority to protect its drinking water supplies that exist in upstream communities. And we see that really as an environmental justice issue, because in many cases that downstream community is suffering from other environmental burdens. They're marginalized, they're poor, and they are literally without power to protect that water supply that's so critical to their health. This includes in my area, the Hudson River estuary itself, which serves 100,000 people, a drinking water supply, and many of its tributaries, whether directly or dammed portions of them that have become reservoirs. Water quality in these areas is already impacted by disinfection byproducts, harmful algal blooms. These are challenges that are going to go more difficult to manage with climate change. And while New York State has started programs to assist communities with developing protection programs, I can tell you they need all the help they can get, and WOTUS is part of that. Now on to swimmable for a minute. I just want to share just some anecdotes that are really fun about the Hudson River. Few people realize we just last week had the 20 bridges swim around Manhattan. This is part of the triple crown of open water swimming. Athletes come from all over the world to swim around Manhattan. This week we have the 8 bridges Hudson River swim. This is an open water swim event, the longest marathon swim in the world. The Hudson River is the people's beach. It's not just these event swims. It's people jumping off their boats. It's finding any shoreline possible to get wet. I can tell you as the father of a 10-year-old, if it's a puddle or a stream or a river or a water of the United States, they are going to find their way to it, and we need to make sure it's safe for them to do so as much as possible. Finally, on the fishable, in the Hudson, we have one of the most productive estuaries in the world, and yet very few fish can be safely caught and consumed because of toxic contamination. Our population numbers are also severely depleted from habitat destruction and overfishing. But where it comes to reducing pollution, toxic legacy contaminants, and novel contaminants, we have to do everything we can to keep them out of the water, out of the fish, so that we can restore the abundance and our access to it. Thank you.
Great, Dan, thank you. I've got Jim, then Dominique, then Greg. Jim, please.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jim Murphy with National Wildlife Federation. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the effort put into organizing it. I'm with NWF. I've been working on waters of the U.S. and Clean Water Act issues for most of my career at NWF, and then before that as well. So I know it well. I'm also, I live in Vermont and have lived most of my life in the Northeast. I am slightly older than the Clean Water Act, and I grew up near the shores of Lake Erie. So I know the initial success of the Clean Water Act, and a lot of the folks before me talked about other successes, whether it was just the Hudson that we just talked about, which has also benefited greatly from the Clean Water Act, Boston Harbor, the Charles River, obviously Senator Muskie and the Androscoggin River, which was once famously so polluted that apparently paint peeled off of nearby buildings. So I think the story of the Northeast and the Clean Water Act is really one of restoration, and obviously for a good portion of these 50 years, it has been hugely responsible in turning an area and rivers that were greatly decimated by untreated sewage, by untreated industrial pollution, clean a lot of those rivers up. But I also think the Northeast in some way is kind of a window into where we need to go next. The Northeast in some ways has some of the best state and local level protections, and yet without a real strong federal baseline, we're starting to see a lot of problems creep in again. I think a perfect example is Lake Champlain, which is really has been the crown jewel of Vermont and the Adirondack region of New York. That lake is in increasing trouble, and it's climate change, it's forest fragmentation, it's agriculture on the landscape, and a lot of the pollution is coming from the degradation of upstream waters that are allowing phosphorus and other nutrients to enter that lake in unsustainable quantities, causing algal bloom pollution problems, creating days where it's not safe to swim, it's not safe to have your pet in the water. And without strong federal protections for the entirety of the watershed, even a region like the Northeast that has state and local governments that are doing a lot to protect their watersheds and their aquatic ecosystems, we are not going to be able to keep our waters clean, especially with the increased precipitation, the increased temperatures, the more intense weather events that climate change is bringing, as well as just the development and other pressures that are going to be exerted on our waters. So, very, very glad that the EPA is looking into this and look forward to a discussion about how we can move forward.
Great. Thank you, Jim. I've got Dominique, Greg, Ruth. Dominique, please.
Well, thanks for having me here today. And I should probably start with a little bit of background before introducing my current role. I had a career in water, was a career public servant with US EPA, and in fact managed many water programs across the country. So I appreciate all the comments being made today. And I continue to work in that regard, but had always realized that much, related to the health of our water bodies had to do with our land use practices. And in fact, landscape ecology, the interconnectedness and the fragmentation of our hydrology has led to the deterioration of our water bodies in our local creeks and streams. In fact, I worked on the TMDL program and saw that, much of that fragmentation upstream, whether you're talking about an intermittent stream or a wetland, had negative consequences. And indeed, water had nowhere to go. We couldn't fulfill the hydraulic cycle. And ultimately, with more development and land use, saw runoff and volumetrics and flashiness, which destroyed our water body. And we really won't get those functions back, but in this age of climate, it's worse. And so today I find myself working for a developer, worked in the public right away. And of course, in government, we don't really focus on land use. We don't focus on water quantity, but they're all related. And so I was very interested in working for Hugo New as the Senior VP for Sustainability. I handle environmental health and safety, but importantly, working with Wendy New, who's a very sustainably focused, environmentally focused CEO, owns Kearney Point, which is a 130-acre former federal shipbuilding site. We are on a peninsula right between the Hackensack and Passaic rivers. We are surrounded by water. And as Wendy has had a vision, which is very much not only focused on sustainability, but also justice. We are surrounded, Newark is nearby, by environmental justice communities. How do we fairly and equitably improve these resources for improved health for these communities, but also for sustainable jobs in this age of climate? I have led a two-dimensional water study at Kearney Point during 2012's Hurricane Sandy was 4 or 5 feet underwater, and over $100 million in losses. And that's never been lost on Wendy, as the site, which is 130 acres, has been redeveloped more sustainably, raising it 14 feet. We are now potentially looking at raising it 16 feet. However, the Meadowlands is right above us, and were it not for those Meadowlands, we would have been even more impacted during Sandy. And we expect to see more of that coming as a result of the study that we've done. And what we found in terms of looking at everything from retreating parts of the property that on the beautiful waterfront in the Hackensack to raising the property and putting in interventions like retention basins, because water honestly has nowhere to go. You've got storm surge and tidal surge. And we really got to look at storage. We found that we could do everything possible, but would only get us to addressing 47% of the problem. What is very important as a point that I want to make today is coming from the development community who has had an interesting history with wetlands. The Meadowlands, for example, someone mentioned, using the use of wetlands in a negative fashion. Meadowlands had landfills in these precious wetlands, and there's now efforts to try to restore the 8,000 acres that are remaining. We have to depend upon surrounding wetlands and marshes. We have them around our property. We plan to continue to restore those marshes because honestly, it's a much more sustainable investment, but there are no incentives for us to do so. And in fact, during these days of e-commerce, the property around our areas, which are all being warehousing, we've been committed to creating diverse jobs with emerging technologies and renewable energy and water technologies for climate, et cetera. But all around us is warehousing, $8 million an acre. And it doesn't mean you have to really worry about those marshes around you. E-commerce is driving all decisions. And so there needs to really be some incentive. There needs to be some support through WOTUS for the development community, incentives and disincentives. With that kind of investment in properties where people are making money, it becomes a huge pressure on local municipality decision makers to resist where we are in a 99% impervious area to let another business come in and put in more imperviousness. There are, I think, a lot of points to make today, but the services that these resources give us, what we've also discovered by destroying them is what we're paying for today. So all society pays for this. And I also want to just mention that we have yet to learn, speaking of toxics, Hackensack is about to be listed as another Superfund site. We know how those toxics accumulated in these waters. Passaic is already listed, but PFAS, as many folks have mentioned, and an area that I dealt with in managing the water programs, is continuing to be a very persistent, pervasive issue that I think we're all concerned how we're going to pay for it, how we're going to address it, how we're going to make sure we're protecting lives. And recently, principal researchers at Princeton colleges found a wetland soil microbe that breaks down PFAS. So as we talk about the importance of these water resources for quality of life in many ways, let's also not forget what they also bring us in terms of those subpopulations that could give more meaning to a sustainable, resilient, healthy planet. So thanks, I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much. I've got Greg, then Ruth. Greg.
Hi, my name is Greg Pont. I live in West Garden, Maine. I grew up in Southeast Mass, East Taunton, along nearby the Pond River. So I grew up as a child along the banks of one of the most polluted rivers in Massachusetts. So in 1970, my parents moved me to Maine, Auburn, Maine, on the banks of the Androscoggin, and thinking that, well, I'm going to Maine, it's going to be better. Well, it was the same. The Androscoggin River was extremely filthy. I went to a little high school, graduated in '72, and you couldn't open up the windows in that school up on a hill less than a mile from the Androscoggin because of the stench. So Governor Muskie was the governor from 55 to 59 in Maine, and then he was elected to the Senate from 59 to 1980. And as you well know, he was able to successfully override Nixon's veto in the fall of '72. And in October of '72, the Clean Water Act comes along. The irony is he grew up on the banks of the Rumford, which is north of Auburn by about an hour's drive. And to this day, that river that started the Clean Water Act as his impetus still does not meet standard. Now here in Maine, standard is defined by the statutes. You can look it up, AA, A, B, C, non-attainment. And many sections of the Androscoggin below Rumford, there's sections that are C, trying to go to B. But the area downstream of Rumford, there's a dam called Gulf Island, where during the summertime, the oxygen levels are so poor for fish, below 5 parts per million, they pump in oxygen at different levels above the dam. So I just think it's ironic that the river that spawned the Clean Water Act to this day does not pass it. Now, as president of Kennebec Valley Trout Unlimited, we were part of the Kennebec Coalition. We were able, with other partners, to remove the Edwards Dam, the first FERC licensed dam to be removed in the United States with a valid license in Augusta, Maine. Upstream, we were instrumental in removing Fort Halifax, which has on the Sebasticook River, a trib to the Kennebec below Waterville. That river now has the largest run of alewives in the United States. Then another dam was removed on the Sandy River, which is an Atlantic salmon river. Then we got involved with a couple of dam removals on the Penobscot. So what I've seen is when these dams are removed, the water quality goes up because water doesn't like to be stagnant. In an impoundment, it's neither a stream, a river, or a pond. It's an impoundment. It doesn't really do either very well, to say the least. So that's basically where I'm coming from, is involved with the moving water in Maine on the major rivers. And one thing I will mention that the state of Maine just recently, and it comes into effect January 1st, is the state of Maine has signed into a new law entitled An Act to Stop, and instead of using the long term, I'll just say PFAS, pollution. The law includes new manufacturer notification requirements, prohibition on the sale and distribution of new PFAS products, and also has provisions for developing a new state PFAS source reduction program. Now, here in Maine in the 1970s, they were looking for a way to get rid of the sludge from these water treatment plants. So they thought it was going to be a really inexpensive way to spread it on farmers' fields. And they did. And they did it up until recently. But then all of a sudden, people are starting to have major problems about these PFAS. And now they're finding after testing, and they have just scratched the surface of this. If you go on some of the state of Maine sites, you will see the farms that they've tested, and they've basically stopped the dairies from selling the milk. They've stopped them from selling their produce. Now it's become a really big problem. Deer in one town was tested, and then they said anybody who shot a deer in this area, do not eat it. So this is endemic. They've tested ponds and rivers, and they're finding it's everywhere. So as a recreational fisherman and a person who likes organic gardening, this here is striking home across the state. Now there's parts of the states, of course, especially in the Northwest area. And a previous speaker is living in the Holton area, representing the Maliseet. To the west of there's a lot of land that nobody lives in. Chances are good there's no PFAS there because there was no reason for industry to spread it or industry to be there. But down in the lower section of the state of Maine, which is highly developed, it's a major problem. And this problem, I don't know what the solution is. I've heard of something that can eat this stuff. Well, it's got a lot of eating to do is all I got to say. Anyways, that's where my interest is.
Great. Thank you, Greg, very much. Ruth, you're up.
Okay, just a sec. Okay. I'm Ruth Ladd. I retired from the Corps of Engineers New England District, where I served for many years as the chief of the Policy Analysis and Technical Support Branch in the Regulatory Division. And prior to that, in the same Regulatory Division, I was a senior wetland scientist. Now, I spent 28 years in the Regulatory Division and included several years in the Enforcement Branch. And also am on the Lexington, Massachusetts Conservation Commission, so a very local way to look at things. And that for about 5 years, and they have jurisdiction under the Massachusetts Wetland Protection Act, and we have a local town bylaw. So I've seen things from sort of both sides of jurisdictional issues. I've been, and just as an aside, I have so appreciated listening to everybody who came before me, and all the wonderful comments and very specific stories that relate to the quality of water and the extent of what is regulated by the federal government. My professional experience involved making jurisdictional determinations under WOTUS, as well as confirming and performing wetland delineations. So because of all those years I was with the Corps, the definition of WOTUS has changed a number of different times, and I had to learn how to determine which resources were or were not jurisdictional. Some of the iterations were easy, but they made no sense scientifically, and others were more scientific, but very much more time consuming to determine. What I'm hoping is that the Corps and EPA can come up with a scientifically based, but not overly burdensome work-wise definition of WOTUS to make it more, excuse me, work better for the people who have to actually make these determinations. It can be, and sometimes that burden is put on permanent applicants. Pardon me, I'm getting hoarse. And it puts a lot of cost on them. And to be fair, I mean, I don't see why they should have to, if the Corps doesn't do it and somebody else has to do it, regardless, it's a huge amount of work. It's hard to think of a community where the health of its water bodies isn't critical. Even communities that are on regional water supplies that are outside that community for drinking water are affected by the health of the aquatic resources in their community, as those waters are still used for recreation, for fishing and swimming, boating. They serve for flood storage critically, and waterway flow maintenance, carbon storage in the case of wetlands, and habitat for many species that make our local environments ecologically healthy and aesthetically pleasing. I should note that during my time in the enforcement section at the Corps, I was told by many state and local officials, and perhaps I even heard about it from some of the other federal folks, but I've heard about it throughout New England, that although there were state laws that regulated the work in and near wetlands and waters, and this alludes a little bit to what some of you others have said, they were really glad to have the Corps and EPA have jurisdiction and the associated enforcement help, sort of as the gorilla in the closet, which was their words, not mine, but I've used them many times since. Because although the federal agencies can't address every violation that comes up, sometimes they can make a statement, if you will, by taking action, and it spreads the word, if you will. I think a lot of people, and what has been mentioned by others, is that there isn't a sense by so many people of what they're doing on their property and how it will impact the overall ecosystem, which of course, water is at the base of it. If we don't have the water, the ecosystems aren't going to exist either, or they will be changed dramatically. I think I'm going to save my rest of my comments for the questions. Thanks.
Great. Ruth, thank you. Okay, everybody, we've reached the point of the roundtable where we're going to move into our discussion blocks. What folks are going to see up on the screen once I'm able to get my mouse down there is the next discussion question. There we go. Sorry about that. There we are. Our first set of discussion questions are on regionally specific water bodies. And the way that this is going to work is I'm going to ask folks to raise your hand by hitting Alt-Y or hitting reactions, and then raise hand, or if you can't figure out how to use raise hand, just shoot me a chat and I will get you in the queue. I will identify who's in the queue. I'll call you out by name. I'll invite you to unmute. And I will be in real time trying to get a sense of how many folks are in the queue and how much time folks have. And I'll be giving you those verbal signals about how much time. What I'm asking is that folks go ahead and look at this discussion question here and start to raise your hand so I can develop my queue. And then once I do that, I'm going to ask that folks maybe spend 2 minutes or less on the question. And if we get through everyone who has their queue and you have additional thoughts that you want to share, I'm going to invite you to feel free to raise your hand again in each of these. So we've got 3 discussion blocks, and the first one here is on regional specific water bodies. So my order, I've got Jim, then Gabriella, and then I will look for additional folks. So Jim, jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, given the how wet the Northeast is and how interconnected waters are, I think it's, I don't think it's exaggerating to say that pretty much all water bodies in the Northeast are significant in the overall value to the aquatic system, to protecting the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of our nation's waters. I think particularly at risk though, and I think some of the things we really have to think about, if we want to protect our large waters that we've talked about, like the Hudson, like Lake Champlain, like the Chesapeake Bay, like Androscoggin, et cetera, are those upper reach waters. I think with increasing forest fragmentation, with climate change, with the increased precipitation we're seeing, the wetlands, the first order streams, et cetera, are very important. I mean, there's some pretty good facts out there. I believe, something like, wetlands are responsible for, I think, about 90% of pollution removal for water that enters, first order streams. So preserving those upper reach wetlands does an incredible job of, ensuring that a lot of pollutants are dealt with at the very top of the watershed. Similarly, with things like water retention, also very important. So you're reducing flooding, reducing scouring, reducing the type of washout that brings nutrients downstream. Wetlands and high order streams, or low order streams, sorry, are really important to that. And that, and if we protect those streams, that goes a long way towards protecting the larger bodies right now that are seeing problems such as algal blooms and nutrient overloading, et cetera. So I will stop there because I think I'm at my 2 minutes.
Great. Jim, I appreciate it. Thank you. Got Gabriella, Drew, Sherry, then Ruth. Gabriella.
Yes, thank you. Staten Island, especially, we're on the northwest coast of Staten Island, and we have Arthur Kill, we have Newark Bay. Arthur Kill is to the west, Newark Bay is to the northwest. It's a very large body of water, and Kill-Vancouver to the north of us, and we're very close to all 3 of them. Then we have underground streams, which are not plotted and they're not considered in city planning, and so homes have been destroyed because of these underground streams during flooding. We've got lots of pollution in Arthur Kill, including uranium that was there from World War II. And when flooding occurs in that area, it goes to people's homes. There are 21 toxic sites on the North Shore that nobody's looking at. We have Old Place Creek, which is the tidal wetland in the Graniteville wetland, which has an underground stream, and some of those underground streams have been implicated in the damage to homes that are far away from us, and nobody's looking at that either. The other thing I wanted to bring up too is that we have a combined sewer system here, and every time there is construction, and because Staten Island is one of the only places left in New York City that has land, there's a lot of construction here, and every time there's construction, the effluent goes into the combined sewer system, and when it overflows in the one sewer treatment plant that we have on the North Shore, it overflows during rainstorm and it goes into the harbor. So we've got lots of problems here, and we're surrounded by water, and nobody has taken that into consideration when these projects are proposed. This project, the South Avenue Retail Project, is on 18 acres of land. And this community, Graniteville, which I said before is an EJ community, environmental justice, it is in trouble. Thank you.
Great. Gabriella, thank you. I've got Drew, then Sherry, then Ruth. Drew, please.
Thanks. Yeah, we specifically work in, we sit and we do research in the Delaware River watershed. And because we're in Pennsylvania, we're also very connected to the Susquehanna River and ultimately the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And maybe what I just want to share is I should have brought it up when I was introducing myself, but I think Denise used the word soil health. And I doubt the word soil health is regulated by EPA or WOTUS, or, it's in there. It's mostly an NRCS or USDA thing. But I think it's a critically important part of cleaning our water. We really find, that a lot of times agriculture is looked at as the demon, and then, the result of contamination. But from our research, we're finding that if you do agriculture right, and we like to use the word regenerative organic, you can actually improve the soil health, which ultimately leads to water quality and quantity. And I know Pennsylvania's a little behind some other states in the region, but Maryland's a good example where they've actually passed a soil health bill. And they have much greater funding going to conservation practices on farms because they're working to fund those. So things like cover crops and other conservation practices, but very often farmers are hesitant to put those into practice because it can sometimes mean taking land out of production or extra costs or a burden to a farmer. But we're seeing in our research that they can have dramatic roles in cleaning the water and water quality if we can find a way to help farmers, find a way for farmers to implement those conservation practices. So thank you.
Drew, thank you. I've got Sherry, Ruth, then Denise, then Greg. Sherry, please.
Thank you. The Holton Band of Maliseet has a reservation community and about 1,500 acres of trust land along the main stem of the Medexnicag River. The Medexnicag itself is a tributary or headwater of a very large international watershed, and we would highlight intermittent, ephemeral, and other headwater streams as well, and they contribute to cold water and increased flows downstream in the Medexnicag. So Maine's Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife has told us for years that cold water tributaries in the Medexnicag watershed are key to the health of its brook trout population. Those cold water tributaries are indispensable to our plans for sea-run salmon restoration. Better information on the location, extent, and contribution of ephemeral intermittent streams and cold water refugia in the Medexnicag headwaters will help us determine where to best begin actively introducing salmon and identify areas for conservation or other methods of protecting this precious resource. Ephemeral and intermittent streams are most active during spring runoff and provide flow important for sea run outmigration. In discussion with U.S. Geological Survey staff, we've heard that current LIDAR maps are limited in their ability to show distinctions between ephemeral, intermittent, and perennial first order streams in our headwaters, and it sounded like very many watersheds around their headwaters. Those are hard distinctions to make with our current technology. Cold water refugia, sites where groundwater enters the tributary, are critical in summer months for cold water fisheries like salmon. We are talking to another number of federal and state agencies about our options for mapping these groundwater seeps, but it's proving to be especially challenging. We've got a pretty large watershed. It could take us a long time to make those, to map those resources. Headwater seeps also contribute to summer flow downstream in larger order streams in our watershed. So in Maine, all our streams are gaining streams. So during periods of drought, the water we see in rivers and streams is essentially base flow, that is groundwater inputs. So according to one USGS hydrologist I've talked to, base flow is what we see in the Medexnicag after as little as 5 to 7 days of no rain during the summer. So it's a hard distinction to make, but what is it groundwater? Is it surface water? It's just groundwater that's made it to the surface. So I appreciate all the comments around connectivity and one water. The summer drought of 2019 gave us a pretty stark view of what minimal base flow looks like in the main stem of our Medexnicag, and that is a mostly dewatered channel with flowing water hardly evident. And that's all I'll say right there.
Great. Sherry, thank you. So I've got about 6 people in the queue, and we've got about 10 or 12 minutes left here. So I think we've got our list for this session here. So I ask that folks keep it to 2 minutes. I've got Ruth, then Denise, then Greg. Ruth, please jump in.
Sure. Eastern vernal pools are the aquatic resource that comes immediately to my mind as a regionally specific one. I realize that they are found outside of what I think you're calling Northeast, but it's mostly to the Northeast. And they're really different from the Western vernal pools, which have been recognized in some of the WOTUS definitions, which has always bothered me because they leave out the Eastern ones, which I think are very important. Most are physically separated from like the tributary system with upland in between. Not all of them by any means. But many of them are ecologically linked to that system, and some are hydrologically connected by groundwater, such that the rise and fall of the waterway affects the vernal pools, or the vernal pools water discharges into via groundwater into the waterways, which sustains that base flow that has been mentioned so many times. Many are ecologically connected by serving as critical habitat for species that use one or more vernal pools and a waterway. And of course, well, there's some that what define the vernal pool are actually fauna that only use vernal pools, but they're non-obligate species that require both. Intermittent streams are another one they're found all over the country, and everybody hears about the ones in the arid West being so critical, but they're critical here too, and others have mentioned that too. And aside from several vernal pools, my town only has headwaters, and most of them and their associated wetlands, and many of them are intermittent. And adverse effects to them, the fact that they're intermittent is sort of looking like a glass half empty, glass half full means that if there's water there sometimes, and that water goes downstream. So impacts that happen to the watershed around them, and of course, the closer it is to those intermittent streams, the more dramatic the impact is. And so work and discharges into them or adjacent to them results in local flooding. It can affect downstream waters and ultimately to degradation of tidal wetlands and the waters, tidal wetlands and waters, and they're already under serious threat from sea level rise. So even the intermittent streams have just dramatic impacts throughout. And somebody else already said that basically every water in the Northeast is sort of part of the whole system. And I absolutely agree with that.
Great. Ruth, thank you. I've got Denise, Greg, and Dominique. Denise, please.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to make this connection when we're talking about water resources between drinking water supply watersheds, what we call source water protection areas, and watersheds in general. And a lot of times we're talking about large watersheds, like, for example, Long Island Sound. And a lot of times there's a disconnect here, somewhat between the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. And I don't think the public understands it, but we're seeing a kind of a, if you will, a little bit of a discrimination where the Safe Drinking Water Act, a lot of the dollars really focus on water utilities and treatment plants and those types of things, and not general watershed management. And so we're kind of leaving our source water protection areas behind when we're talking about watershed management that's more funded through the Clean Water Act. And so when we're talking about, waters of the United States, and we start, not looking at them as one water, we have a problem. And I'm just going to give you an example. And we heard about this in terms of large watersheds and where people are getting their drinking water supply. But the Long Island Sound watershed is the water supply for the city of Boston, the city of Hartford, the city of Springfield, the city of New Haven, multiple cities in New York as well. So we have all of these public drinking water supply watersheds that are within the Long Island Sound watershed, and yet we have separate programs and we don't look at them all collectively. And I think we need to, when we're talking about waters of the United States, we need to look at this connectivity. We need to look at how we leverage dollars by looking at our programs. And one other example I just want to say is that if we look at states' integrated water resources plan, a lot of them don't talk about source water protection, or they talk about it very lightly. They really are looking at that, the emphasis on the delisting and the 303D list. And I think we need to go beyond that. And then one of the challenges there, and you're hearing a lot of people talk about, is the intermittent streams, the headwaters, the wetlands. And that's where these resources are not being protected because they don't see them as critical to the delisting. And so there's a lot of emphasis on delisting streams and not protecting watersheds as a whole. And we need to be thinking of protecting watersheds as a whole. Thank you.
Denise, thank you. I've got Greg, then Dominique, then Lori, then John. Greg.
Well, Maine has the largest distribution of brook trout in the United States. That's lakes and ponds and in streams, rivers, brooks, etc. Actually, there's over They've noted over 22,000 miles of brook trout habitat. So the two largest problems for brook trout into the future is water quality and water temperature. And as the climate heats up, I think these fish will become the canaries in the coal mine. And I've just, in the short time I've been on planet Earth, I'm just under 70, that I've seen places where warm water fish, such as bass and perch, have overtaken the brook trout populations. Now, the further north you go, less population of people, then the brook trout are more intact. And considering when the colonists showed up here, the entire state had brook trout to where we are now, even though we have the largest population in the United States, it's probably a far cry from what it was just a few hundred years ago. So I just want to emphasize water quality and water temperature are the biggest challenges to salmonids in the state of Maine. And that, of course, includes the Atlantic salmon that we've been trying to get in the major rivers and the small streams here in Maine back. Thank you.
Great, Greg, thank you. I've got Dominique, Lori, then John. Dominique.
Yeah, sure. I just want to quickly, for the record, make a case to continue to prioritize from a justice authority standpoint, the critical, the wetlands in these urban and disadvantaged communities. And as an example, again, for the record, the Meadowlands, which is an important island of wetlands in a landscape that has lost most of its coastal wetlands. The only other large estuarine wetland in the New York metropolitan area is Jamaica Bay National Wildlife Refuge. And so consequently, the Meadowlands becomes especially important for its ability to provide food and resting habitat for hundreds of migratory bird species as part of the Atlantic Flyway. We have a pair of nesting eagles at our site in this industrial corridor, as well as breeding habitat for more than 60 resident bird species. Apart from the human pressures on this ecosystem, however, are serious ecological pressures facing the Meadowlands. Aerial photographs over a period of 30 years show that some marshes which were not filled or altered have lost half of their open water. And so again, much of this area is still privately owned. It needs protection. The marshes, the mud flats, the shrubland, the non-tidal wetlands needs to maintain some degree of protection, and also particularly given it's also surrounded by disadvantaged communities.
Great. Dominique, thank you. I've got Lori, then John. Lori, please.
Hi, thanks. Mostly I just want to reiterate and support what a few folks have said. I've done a lot of work and research in the New York City water supply watershed on using LiDAR to improve wetlands mapping. And we've also derived a local resolution national hydrography data set for the watershed. And local resolution is the highest resolution you can get. I think it's about 1 to 1,000. And even with this high resolution data, we still don't know, we haven't attributed, I think it's about 36% of the stream miles in that watershed. We haven't attributed the flow regime to that. So I just wanted to support that. It is very difficult to take remote sensing data and do accurate stream flow attribution. And so that's where it gets very difficult when you'll see all these projections about the different definitions of WOTUS and what portions of the wetlands may be affected. The numbers change so much just based on the quality of your source data. So I wanted to reiterate that. Also in the New York City watershed, when we looked at LiDAR to improve the mapping of wetlands themselves, using LiDAR followed by manual editing more than doubled the amount of mapped NWI wetlands on our west of Hudson and our unfiltered part of the watershed. So again, a lot of the resources that much of the country, like we have a luxury data set in New York, we have the luxury of focusing on a small area, but a lot of the data sets around the country aren't going to give you a really accurate assessment of what wetlands are vulnerable, and not only that, what wetlands are present. And I would argue that the unmapped ones are likely among the most vulnerable. They may be the drier end, they may be the ephemerally connected. So we don't even know what we might be losing without broad protection. And I guess the other point that I wanted to talk about is reiterating the importance of the headwaters We did work with Fish and Wildlife some years ago with something like over 55% of the wetlands, based on that set of data at that time. They are up in the headwaters, where they may be more on the intermittent connected end, and definitely have a lot of contact with the lands and are critical for water quality protection. I think that's all I wanted to reiterate. Thank you.
Lori, thank you. John, last comment here on this discussion block, and then we're going to be moving to the discussion block on climate change impacts. John, please.
Great, thanks. Just to reiterate what a lot of folks have said, although the Northeast is relatively wet, it has seasonal and rain dependent and headwater streams, just as all other regions of the country do. Several years ago, EPA estimated the number of people who rely on drinking water supplied from systems that draw from intermittent, ephemeral, or headwater streams. And just to read into the record what that means for the Northeast, about a little more than 2 million people in Connecticut, about 280,000 people in Delaware, roughly 5 million in Massachusetts, almost 4 million in Maryland, over 450,000 in Maine, over 500,000 in New Hampshire, 4 million in New Jersey, more than 11 million in New York, more than 8 million in Pennsylvania, and more than 500,000 people in Rhode Island. And so these resources are critical wherever they're found, but including in New England and the Northeast generally.
Great. John, thank you. Okay, so we are going to switch discussion blocks. What I want to do is I want to do the exact same thing that we did in this first discussion block. You all were awesome. We're all very mindful of time, very respectful of each other's time. Use the hand raise, use the hand lower feature. So I don't even know if I'm necessary anymore, but just in case I am, I'm going to stick around. And so we're going to use the discussion question up there on climate change impacts. Again, I'm asking folks to raise their hand by hitting Alt-Y or by pressing the reactions button, raise hand, or shooting a chat, and then I will queue up our list. Ruth, jump in.
Oh, I get to be first. Nice. Climate change has resulted in dramatic changes in our precipitation patterns here in the Northeast. We hear a lot around the world about what's happened with all these changes of droughts and such, but we're having them too. And some of them have been affecting, well, agriculture certainly has been hit hard, but everybody has. There's rivers dried up that are being relied on for drinking water, and all the other uses of these rivers. And so it's not just the droughts, but then we have these enormous storms that then create, there's a lot of erosion, flooding, all that sort of thing. And the wetlands are a critical resource to help minimize the impacts. Will they get rid of all of the impacts? No, of course not. But they serve as, sponges for holding the water, and then they release it slowly. But they also serve as buffers to erosion. Vegetation helps hold it. So they help maintain our healthy wetlands. And I should note, and other people have alluded to it too, it's not just the wetlands. Recognizing that waters of the United States do not extend into the uplands, but I'm a firm believer in the importance of buffers, upland buffers, to these resources, that to have them preserved through some means, in some cases through compensatory mitigation, that happens to be near and dear to my heart, as well as other programs. And it helps to minimize flooding, maintain those base flows that we've heard so much about, minimizing erosion, not recognizing the linkage between all of these aquatic resources and the uplands, and their likely modification, thanks to our warming climate, will be devastating to both the natural environment and the built environment. Thanks.
Great. Ruth, thank you. I've got Sherry, Denise, Gabriella, then Dan. Sherry, please.
Thank you. So I wanted to talk a little bit about legacy land use impacts and how it's affecting how climate change is interacting with long ago human activity. So in the Medux-Nickeg, the main stem Medux-Nickeg, aquatic habitat and water quality impairment includes elevated water temperature from basically loss of shade due to riparian buffer converted to active farmland, happened long ago, and a loss of structural complexity in the river channel due to impacts from logging and dams in the 1800s. So that in particular, the loss of structural complexity, I should point out that what it results in is a flat and wide and shallow channel, and it warms more quickly than it otherwise would. So the elevated air temperature air temperatures that are coming with climate change are exacerbating these land and water use impacts. And I should also, I do want to point out that we are also concerned about wetlands. I know we've talked a lot about intermittent and ephemeral streams, but we are, interested in wetlands. We have a model that we've created with U.S. Geological Survey to conduct research into how hydrological changes might affect culturally significant wetland plants and that live in the riparian zone. And those include basket ash, fiddlehead ferns for food, and medicinal herbs such as muskrat root. So there's so much uncertainty in those impacts that, are met depending on future precipitation. Our wetlands may contract, expand, migrate, change in water quality and type, or quality and type. And we need a WOTUS definition that accommodates that kind of variability and uncertainty.
Sherry, thank you. I've got Denise, Gabriella, Dan, Dominique. Denise, please.
I wanted to reiterate what was said about the flashiness and the droughtiness that's happening, the flashy storms we're having, where we have all the rain at once, and then we have these dry periods. It's really problematic, particularly for wetlands and intermittent streams. Again, it's not just a quantity issue, it's a quality issue, the quality problems that we're seeing, but we're also seeing changes in vegetation. We now have in the Connecticut River, hydrilla that's just taking over, and some new strains of hydrilla that's going up the entire watershed. It's been documented up through Massachusetts, and we don't know how far up that watershed that's going to be. And then, once it's in one watershed, we're already seeing it in other watersheds, including in public drinking water supplies. And what is this going to mean in terms of managing hydrilla in a public drinking water supply in New England? We really haven't had that challenge before, and we're starting to see that. So that's some of the things. The other thing I just wanted to point out is this nexus between food supply, water, and energy. There's a nexus there, and it's really related to soil and soil health. And we need to be paying attention that we need all of these, and soil is the common denominator. And particularly, I wanted to talk about wetlands and wetland soils and, the role that they play from a water quality perspective, from a quantity perspective, in terms of really wetlands are that regulator. They regulate the systems. So, like when we have this flashiness, when we have the droughtiness, it's the wetlands that play that role. And are they now going to be impacted by climate change so that they don't play that role as effectively? And how do we protect them? But also from this nexus of water and energy and whatever, the carbon sequestration, we hear a lot about that in terms of our tidal wetlands. But for example, in New England, when you look at the vast amount of inland wetlands we have, even though they don't store as much carbon as tidal wetlands, they still store a lot of carbon. And a lot of the work that has been done on carbon storage in New England, particularly in New England forests like red maple swamps, which is a dominant wetland type in New England, all of the information is about above ground carbon storage from these forests. And there has been very little work done about the below ground carbon storage of our freshwater wetlands. And we really need to have a better handle on that. I know some folks are working on this, but I think it's really important that when we're talking about wetlands and we're talking about those ecosystem services they're providing, we need to think about it from a climate change perspective as well and make sure that we're talking about it that way. Thank you.
Denise, thank you. I've got Gabriella, Dan, Dominique, and Lori. Gabriella, please.
Yes, thank you. Staten Island is a small island, and as an island, of course, was surrounded by water. Hurricane Sandy was a storm surge. Hurricane Ida was a torrential rainstorm. We had 3.5 inches of rain per hour, where our sewer systems can only handle 1.5 inches per hour. So that was overwhelming. This is really a serious emergency. And as I've heard, the East Coast, the New York City area sea level was rising faster in that area than anywhere else on the East Coast. So we've got that to contend with also. Our projection maps that I've seen, and I've seen many of them, show that the northwest coast, where Graniteville is covered by water in only a few years and totally gone by 2100. This is an emergency. And as an emergency, we should be evaluating every single project to see what effect it has on people and communities and property. And we've really got to look at the other thing too, is that the private sector has to conform to the requirements of the public sector, or we're just spinning our wheels in climate change. They have to conform. And every single, as I said, every single project has to be evaluated. And if it's going to affect climate change, if it's going to affect people and their homes, it can't be happening. So we've got to look at all of that. Thank you.
Gabriella, thank you. I've got Dan, Dominique, Lloyd, and Jim. Dan, please.
Thanks. I just wanted to say, two things that are fairly obvious, but, protecting wetlands upstream is storing floodwaters so they're not streaming downstream and flooding out communities. And we're going to need those at all sizes. And in New York, we will hopefully be protecting some smaller wetlands down to 7 acres with the recent law passed. But we need more. We need the federal government to have a role there as well. And then on water quality, already we are having drinking water supplies with disinfection byproduct problems, with harmful algal blooms. We're having, we had a whole river, the Wallkill River, turn bright green with a harmful algal bloom for 30 miles, persisted for 60 days. That's a recreational river. We're seeing these impacts already. Climate change is only going to make them come faster, more frequent, more extreme, more significant in more places. So we need to get the protections, the protections we have now are insufficient if we're already seeing those impacts, and we're going to need better protections going forward with the changes that are coming with climate. Thanks.
Great. Dan, thank you. I've got Dominique, Lori, Jim, then Rabbi Cardin. Dominique, please.
Yeah, sure. So just a stat, wetlands cover only about 5 to 8% of the world's land surface, but comprise 20 to 30% or more of the world's carbon pool. And this point has been made about the important service that wetlands are playing in terms of greenhouse gases. However, we also know that these intense, more frequent storms are destroying our wetlands. Again, in our area, we've lost a lot of wetlands due to these intensive storms and recent hurricanes. The concern is that there might be a critical water level or point due to the impact of climate at which you're going to have a reverse dynamic where these wetlands begin, due to the pressure, start to release those greenhouse gases. And it's very important, so not only to protect them, but to understand and put a bit more research, but to understand what that could mean and what we would suffer if we don't improve the right kinds of protections for those wetlands. Another aspect of that, of course, is that wetlands, and particularly those around in our area, dramatically reduce property losses during hurricanes. 16% of the property losses were prevented, and that was all over $600 million as a result of Hurricane Sandy that was assessed. We know that we could probably find that if we look at this impact along the whole North Atlantic. But something that's happening right now with the National Floodplain Insurance Program is a rulemaking and revisiting that. I know there was an executive order on improved floodplain management, But as we look at, again, the importance of Fed to Fed in putting more public money out is to integrate the address of wetland protection and these critical water resources being protected to prevent more money being spent unnecessarily, and also to integrate that into the assessment of floodplain management and to actually enable healthier floodplains. And then one final point is having been involved with the evolution of green infrastructure while at EPA, and finally seeing it come into its own where communities are adopting it because of its multiple benefits and its cost effectiveness. It's been evaluated that wetlands outperform gray infrastructure in terms of seawalls. And we're seeing seawalls, speaking of the Infrastructure Act, and again, lots and lots of public money going out there. A lot of gray infrastructure going up all around us. In fact, we know because it's not been coordinated in any way that some of the seawalls in and around upstream are going to exacerbate flooding and impacts for those of us downstream or nearby. And it would be very important to evaluate this sort of green wall, green resilience as a priority for spending public money, along with perhaps some additional assessment, but to incentivize the use and the restoration of wetlands for those natural protections.
Dominique, thank you. I've got Lori, Jim, Rabbi Cardin, and Drew. Lori, please.
Okay, so I'm unmuted, right? Okay.
Yes.
So we do here in the water supply anticipate that the operation of the city's water supply will become increasingly more difficult as the climate continues to change. We've talked about the more frequent and intense storms that are going to exacerbate water quality issues, and also coupled with temperature, thermal effects in the reservoirs. So, increased algal blooms have been mentioned, some of which could be harmful algal blooms, some which could be associated with taste and odor issues. And so reducing the reach of protected waters has the potential to exacerbate these challenges for us. One thing that we know as ecologists is that resilience we increase our resilience when we increase diversity, whether that's diversity across a landscape or biodiversity within a specific habitat. And if we, come up with more restrictive definitions of WOTUS that take certain ecosystem types off the table, I believe that we'll be harming our ability to be resilient. And as wetlands, as we know, have roles both in adapting to climate change and mitigating climate change. So I just wanted to, it goes along the what we've been talking about is the theme of protecting the entire watershed from headwaters to main stem. That is a form of diversity which will promote resilience. I just wanted to mention a couple of things that others have brought up. We are in fact dealing with hydrilla in a drinking water supply. So if anybody wants to reach out to me after, I could talk about that with you if you're faced with a similar challenge. And then in terms of the significant role that wetlands have as carbon stocks in their soil carbon, I would just like to point the panel to a paper by Nalick and Fennessy from 2016 in Nature Communications that used the National Wetland Condition Assessment data. And that paper shows that those inland freshwater wetlands are actually detaining about 10 times more carbon than the blue carbon that we hear so much about, largely because just the extent of palustrine wetlands is so much larger. But I just think it's a role that is often overlooked because there's so much talk about the role of blue carbon in the carbon cycle, but palustrine wetlands are actually detaining, because of their area, significant stocks. And again, if we disturb those wetlands, we're oxidizing that stock into the atmosphere and exacerbating the climate problem. Thanks.
Lori, thank you. I've got Jim, Rabbi Cardin, and then Drew. Jim, please.
Yeah, a lot of, I think what I wanted to say has been said already. But one thing I want to kind of add is, climate change is putting a lot of stress on some upper reach waters that, weren't here, 15, 20 years ago. I mean, an obvious example, at least kind of in northern New England and upstate New York, is snowmaking for skiing. With winters becoming much less predictable, areas are more and more reliant on snowmaking. That's actually taking a lot of water from upper reach streams. It's necessitating alterations to those streams. So the more pressure we put on those streams, the healthier they need to be. If we're also destroying wetlands, if we're further altering those streams, their ability to withstand the extra uses is going to remain a lot lower. Also, agriculture is using water in different and more intensive ways. Again, making the need for wetlands and areas that provide recharge, that store water, that keep that water supply, healthier and more constant. Again, all increases greatly. So, as the climate warms, we're getting stresses on our waters, and particularly our upper ship waters, that weren't here, 15, 20, 30 years ago.
Great. Jim, thank you. Rabbi Cardin, you're up.
Yes, thank you. And I cannot do justice to all of the issues that I know that others in the waterkeeper movement would bring to you today. And I certainly can't speak enough about the Western Maryland. I don't know enough about them, but I do just want to make a couple of points. I want to reiterate one, the Conowingo Dam concern that we have with all of the sediment and nutrients that have been accumulating over the past decades. Now with the current increased water rain events, we are really worried about the scouring behind the dam and all of that sediment nutrients going downstream, and absolutely devastating the Chesapeake Bay and reversing some of the advances that we've had. So that's one concern. I know that many know that there's sunny day flooding, in Annapolis, and so that the sea level rise is certainly already affecting our built infrastructure, which is really going to be devastating, both with dislocation and financially. We have islands in the Chesapeake Bay that are disappearing, and that is devastating historically, as well as practically for the people who live there. And something that hasn't yet been discussed is, at least in Baltimore, when there are heavy rain events and there's a backup with the sewage, that sewage ends up going into households, into their basements. It is a huge health issue that affects not only out people closer to the waters, but just in our urban environments as well. And just one other thing, it is true that the green infrastructure is more cost effective often than the gray infrastructure in mitigating some of these negative impacts of climate change. But also, the more we can make present in people's everyday lives, especially those living more in urban environments, the presence of nature, whether it is, more trees or daylighting streams and protecting the flow of the streams, and just bringing nature closer to people in case people can't get closer to nature, the more it assists the spirit of the community, but it also connects people better to nature, so that they will have a greater desire to assist EPA and RDC and others who need that public support to protect the environment. So somehow using the green infrastructure to be present in people's lives, I think, could be beneficial all around.
Great. Thank you. Drew, before I go to you, I just want to let folks know that we probably have time for 2 or 3 more folks to jump into the conversation. If folks have a reflection on this discussion question, please to do so, please raise your hand and let me know. Currently, Drew is the last person in the queue. If I don't get any other folks raising their hand, then we'll move to discussion block number 3. Drew, take it away.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, when in this discussion about climate change, I think it'd probably be important to give some data from our long-term farming systems trial. So in agriculture, we do see that there's greater rainfall in the spring and fall and less rainfall in the summer when crops are growing. But the majority of agrochemicals that are applied to the land are in April and May during planting. So during those heavy rains, there's potential for them to leach and enter waterways. But from we have a 42-year-old farming systems trial at Rodale Institute, where we're comparing the conventional or standard practice, which represents more than 70% of all the land in the United States, to two organic farming methods. One of those is a low input that has no external inputs at all. What we find over that time is that we have higher soil carbon levels in the organic systems than the conventional. So greater soil carbon sequestration. We're storing carbon in the soil. To put that in perspective, the organic systems in some cases have more than 2% organic matter. And it's said that to kind of put it into perspective, 1%, we could increase the soils in the United States by 1% organic matter. That would be equal to over 333 days of all the water that runs over Niagara Falls. So in some cases, we have more than double that in our organic systems that we're storing and holding on to water, because carbon has a tremendous ability to hold on to moisture and water. We're also measuring infiltration rates. We have infiltration rates that are sometimes 5 times higher in our organic system than in a no-till system, a conventional no-till system. And what that means is that when we have these really heavy rains that are maybe over 5 inches per hour, all that water in the organic system will infiltrate in the soil and not lead to runoff. And one last thing that I think is pretty important to mention is over 40 years, we can have the ability to look at yields during drought years and during normal rainfall season. In every year that we have a low rainfall or drought, the organic system out yields the conventional system. And so the justification for keeping chemicals that are, many of them are delisted in other countries, including undeveloped countries, because we need it to feed our population, is really just not true. The organic systems and regenerative systems are more resilient to climate change, and at the same time can be just as productive with a more chemical-based system. So thank you.
Yeah, Drew, thank you. I've got Gabriella, and then I don't have anyone else in the queue. Again, we have time for probably another 1 or 2 folks here who've got reflection on this. Gabriella, take it away.
Yeah, Graniteville is a community of 60 to 70% people of color. And because of the extensive air pollution that we have here, we have the Staten Island Expressway right next to us. It's one of the heaviest trafficked highways in the Northwest region, the Northeast region. We have Newark Airport, and the planes go over here, and the airstream comes in this direction. We have also chemical refineries, which violate all kinds of regulations by emitting they're polluting the air and polluting the water. And we have no other green open space. We have no other park. So this community is dealing with COPD and asthma and cancer. And without the wetland, without the forest that we lost 1,800 trees. We don't have any way to address those issues. The other thing too is by losing the wetland, where that wetland would have absorbed the water from Hurricane Ida, we didn't have that, and so we were flooded. And the loss of the vernal pools, as well as the wetland soil, the spongy soil, the tidal wetland is the only way to pick up the extra water to address there's no other way to process that water except the tidal wetland. And that was overwhelmed, and we were flooded. And 2 miles away, there were homes that had to be evacuated from the underground streams from the tidal wetland. It's filtering that we don't have anymore. We don't have carbon sequestration. We don't have anything to process the chemicals in the air and the water, and this continues. That's it.
Gabriella, thank you. Dominique, you're up.
Yeah, I just want to make a plug for, we mentioned green infrastructure and the importance of preventative, management and stormwater management. And, as we talk about PFAS, as we talk about pharmaceuticals, as we talk about salt and conductivity going up in source waters, and having, our wastewater treatment reevaluated and our drinking water treatment reevaluated, because we continue to see emerging pollutants in our water supplies. I think it's just as important in this context to reevaluate best management practices, including nutrient management. Chesapeake Bay, again, another TMDL that I worked on, and particularly in urban areas where nitrogen is hard to address as a pollutant. It's easier to address phosphorus because of the sediment relationship. Better management, prevention of manure runoff into water bodies and fertilizers running into water, which is why we're seeing HAB season coming about. So to stress those preventative measures, reevaluate them, look at them for more circular economies, emerging approaches that can generate local economic revitalization. Since we have time, I definitely wanted to talk about the importance of better addressing stormwater runoff.
Dominique, thank you. So I've got Denise, and then probably have after Denise time for one more comment. So Denise, and then I'll be looking for one more person if there's anyone out there. If not, then we will go to the next discussion block. Denise, please.
Yes, I wanted to just bring in the issue of environmental justice. And we talked about water upstream, downstream impacting communities, but I particularly wanted to talk about the cost of treating water. Obviously, we've talked about green infrastructure and watershed protection, source water protection as the most cost-effective and most efficient way. And that's really impactful on our environmental justice communities that are struggling with utility bills, whether it be electric bills, water bills, or sewer bills, wastewater treatment bills. Also, from a water, utility perspective, the cleaner it is coming into your system, it just takes less money to treat it. So we want to make sure that we can reduce bills that way. And then certainly from a water conservation perspective, which we don't necessarily get into as much as the Clean Water Act, but from a water conservation perspective, the water going out to our sewage treatment plants. I worked in a municipality. Our largest utility bill, electric utility bill in the municipality was for our sewage treatment plants. So the less water we can have going out to those sewage treatment plants is really important. So not only is it good for the environment, we don't have to treat as much water, but water conservation is really important. So I wanted to put in that plug because we didn't talk about water conservation here as a tool that we have, but it is really a tool that we should be looking at from a water quality perspective and a water quantity perspective. Thank you.
Great, Denise, thank you. John, you're up.
Great, thanks. I just wanted to circle back to how this all connects to waters of the United States. And, if a feature is not considered a water of the United States, so many of the Clean Water Act's central programs don't apply to it. And that means the, kind of the wetlands that Gabriella mentioned, or features in the New York City drinking watershed would not be protected by an environmental review process that looks at things like, is it in the public interest to destroy these wetlands? And so that's why it's so critical as climate change continues to impact our resources, that we maintain as much as possible the ability to look at the entire watershed and how it relates to other parts of the watershed through the mechanism of the Clean Water Act.
Great, John, thank you. Okay, we're going to move to the next discussion block. Before I do so, though, I just want to, again, reiterate how much I appreciate you all keeping the energy up and the attention up. I know how hard it is to be tethered to your Zoom for a quarter of your workday here, and so really appreciate your all's time and energy, and I promise we'll end on time. We have about 25 minutes left. You with me? Okay, I'm seeing some spattered thumbs up there, so that's great. Okay, so the next discussion topic is jurisdictional determinations. Try saying that fast 10 times. I will not be trying that. And the question here is, how can federal agencies more effectively implement jurisdictional determinations? And so we're going to do the same thing we did before. I'm going to be asking folks to raise their hand. We're going to queue it up, and I'm going to be giving you feedback with regard to our timing. So I've got Gabriella, then Ruth. Gabriella, please.
Okay, thank you again. We went through the New York City ULURP process. The project was approved. We went through the New York State DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation process, and the project was approved. Through all of this, all of these local governments seem to be at odds with the goals of EPA. What can we do about that? And why isn't there more coordination between the two types of government, the federal and the local? I'm wondering anyway. And the other thing I wanted to bring out was that it was our situation with the GD that we needed to do because the developer, the JD was expired during the process of this project. We need to have a representative of EPA come back to the sites. That the question is, before renewing the JD, they need to come back to the site because situations may have changed. There may be a project that it's no longer viable, or maybe it's too harmful now with climate change. We know more now. So there has to be a good evaluation of the situation before approving a JD. And in our case, it seemed like the JD was approved without any review of anything. So those are the 2 points that I wanted to make.
Gabriella, thank you. I've got Ruth, then John, then Sherry, then Jim. Ruth, please.
Having been boots literally on the ground, part of the implementation of JDs, I'm certainly well aware of how important it is to make it scientifically defensible, repeatable, relatively straightforward, and not too time consuming. The New England district that I was part of has been fortunate in that, and it's because all the New England states have wetland laws, some more comprehensive than others. But most permit applicants have to deal with state wetland laws and sometimes local too, and state jurisdiction. And so the applicants are sort of already attuned to having to deal with dealing with protecting the wetlands or addressing the impacts that they propose. And they often don't ask for formal jurisdictional determinations. They either assume all the waters and wetlands are WOTUS and just proceed because it saves time. If you just say it, you don't have to go through the time consuming and therefore money consuming wait to get a jurisdictional determination. Or in some cases, they assume maybe all the waters are jurisdictional, but maybe they think that some of the wetlands are not, so they only then ask for a JD for the ones that they think are not. And usually because they aren't regulated by the state, so they want to just kind of get out from under the regulation part of it. So for the New England district, it makes the implementation much easier. Not to say that it's easy, I won't even pretend that, but I know that in lots of parts of the country, a formal JD is required for every single application. And every application, if there's multiple wetlands that aren't grouped together for some reason, there has to be a separate jurisdictional determination for each of them. And I've certainly heard of applications where there are literally hundreds of JDs needed for one application. And that the time burden is excessive, it's inefficient. I will confess, you're asking for suggestions about how to make it better. I don't really have a good suggestion other than to make sure that the jurisdictional definition is very clear and avoid vague language that can be interpreted differently, because inevitably that's where problems arise. And there gets to be a lot of, and then you get people appealing decisions. It's really messy. So no good suggestions, except to make it as clear as possible. Thank you.
Ruth, thank you. I've got John, then Sherry, then Jim, then Lori. John, please.
Thanks. I have read literally thousands of Army Corps jurisdictional determination forms, and I am sad to report that it is kind of a black box, and people affected by those determinations are essentially excluded from the process. The fact that a project proponent has requested a jurisdictional determination is not known to the public or even to neighboring landowners or communities. The first anyone is likely to know about it is after the fact, and only if they happen to know to check the agency's website databases. And even those are opaque at best. The only thing made available is a summary form, not the supporting materials. And those rarely contain information about the full consequences of the project on the watershed. In my view, this ought to be a public process with an opportunity for input before a decision is made. And the Corps should specify the kinds of information about a site that a project proponent needs to provide before a determination will be made. I think the Corps should also significantly increase the number of site visits it performs. Non-jurisdictional determinations should typically only occur after a Corps site visit. On the flip side, I think that things can be simplified under the significant nexus regime that the agencies are currently implementing and that they have proposed to codify. They should make widely known the results of determinations and use them as precedent in subsequent jurisdictional determinations for the same watershed in which they've already made a decision. Once a type of water body within a watershed is shown to have that relationship to downstream waters, all similar ones in the same watershed should be treated as protected. Thank you.
Great, John, thank you. I've got Sherry, Jim, Lori, then Dominique. Sherry, please.
Thank you. So I wanted to bring back our formal comment letter. One of the reasons I'm here today, and in the formal comment letter, we basically indicated that for the federal government to fulfill its fiduciary trust responsibility to federally recognized tribes such as ours, it is important for there to be a clear understanding of the impacts of the determination on trust resources. And certainly in federal Indian law, we also indicated that there is no distinction between water courses that are perennial, ephemeral, intermittent, or connected to navigable waters. They're all considered trust waters. So the definition just on that point should be as broad and inclusive as possible. I've also heard a couple of times that there's not a lot of data about some of these more the parts of the watershed that seem to be more in question under the significant nexus determination. And to make a determination, you really have to have all the information at your fingertips. You need to know what resource you are dealing with, but the extent, location, and contribution of those resources. Thank you.
Sherry, thank you. I've got Jim, Lori, then Dominique. Jim, please.
Yeah, John said a lot of what I wanted to say, but I just want to reiterate, the impacts of a no jurisdiction determination, really gives, at least from a federal perspective, license for someone to, potentially completely destroy a wetland or stream and all the, the functions that go along with it. So, not subjecting that to sunlight and to a public process. We're appreciative that the NGDs are put online, but as John pointed out, you have to be looking for them. Whereas once you get to the permit process, you do have the opportunity for stakeholders to comment, to see there's notice, et cetera. So I think particularly with NJDs, the need for some sort of public process, I think is really needed. I also want to reiterate that I think NJDs in particular should not be made as desktop determinations. Visiting the site is very important. I think it's very important to understanding what the functions are. Oftentimes when you walk the land, you get a very different perspective than when you're looking at information oftentimes submitted by an applicant, maybe supplemented by, Google Earth or some sort of other online tool. So really want to stress that. And also, I know this is repeating what was said before, but I think there is a lot of efficiency that can be gained by making the most of Justice Kennedy's similarly situated test. And I think not only would that provide, I think protections, and I think protections really based on both sound science and the current law, it would also, I think, provide some certainty in terms of what's protected and what's not. And I think, the Northeast in particular has the type of systems where, there's plenty of science to support, jurisdictional determinations based on similarly situated wetlands and protect wetlands and other waters, in a particular area that are valued downstream.
Great, Jim. Thank you. I've got Lori, then Dominique. Lori.
Hi, thanks. Given what I was saying earlier about the work I've done using LiDAR in the New York City watershed to map wetlands and the work we've done to improve the NHD, we know the shortcomings of the technology. The technology is getting better all the time, but remote sensing will always have shortcomings. So I don't want to see jurisdiction tied to maps. New York State's moving away from the map being the determinant, or whether something is on the map is whether it's jurisdictional or not. And I just wanted to bring that up because I know the preamble of the Navigable Water Protection Rule was really kind of starting to put some language out that there was an exploration of, coming up with these maps that might show some bright line jurisdictional classes. And I think that's, I just don't think the technology's there. And I just wanted to make that point. And in terms of conducting JDs, I know that obviously the process is going to change as the rule changes, but I guess if you could build off of methodologies that is out there, I guess from the 2008 guidance, if that could be streamlined or tweaked to fit whatever is produced, maybe that's a possibility, because the consulting world and the regulated public, well, I wouldn't say the regulated public, but the consultants are maybe used to that. I'm not sure. I haven't ever filled out an entire form and they look pretty onerous. So I'm not sure how much you could build off of that, but I don't know. It seems like it's an expensive process for the applicants. And so I agree with the need to streamline, and I really don't know how to do that, but other than build off of what we have. And I don't know if there's some way of incentivizing the use of a preliminary JD or advertising it better, because it is a time saving and folks would proceed assuming everything is jurisdictional. If there's some way to do that, that would be great in my opinion. Thanks.
Great, Lori, thank you. So I've got one person left in the queue. Dominique, we probably have time for two other commenters. And so I'm seeing if other folks have anything to add. Please go ahead and raise your hand. After our last commenters, John, I'm going to come to you to see if you have any final closing thoughts, and then Sylvia to you, and then Stacy to you. So I'm going to come to Dominique, see if there are other hands. If there are, I'll go to them. If not, I'll come to John for closing comments. Dominique.
Yeah, I just want to offer a tool. I know that we've heard about maps and things like that, but we've also heard that it needs to be less piecemealed. It needs to be watershed driven. Needs to be more transparent for public. Not only public access, but I think there's got to be some education. While at EPA, I actually worked on this approach. Because of big transportation projects, worked with the Corps. Corps was instrumental, and we developed a tool called the Watershed Resources Registry, which was recognizing that clean water and its authorities does tend to stovepipe and sort of drives that piecemeal approach, whereby we really needed more of a watershed approach, recognizing the interconnectedness and relationship of all these resources. So this tool was actually somewhat painstakingly developed and streamlined, actually 8 to 11 regulatory authorities, all about 8 to 10 federal agencies, but working with state agencies. and we included counties because we saw it as a way to get the information out there in terms of what was important to the agencies that protected these resources. It shouldn't be a black box. We saw that some agencies were using the same terms, but with different definitions. So it helped to facilitate communication. We launched it in Maryland, had wonderful resources to invest there due to Chesapeake Bay. Cut down 60% of the time the Corps started using it for its federal listings. And then I launched it in about 7 or 8 states, including New Jersey, got started with it. I think New Jersey's focusing theirs on climate. South Carolina picked it up. So let's not, let's remember, these tools also help us collaborate. When I say us, I'm putting my federal hat on again. They are not only collaborative tools, but they help agencies collaborate by focusing on that watershed to better understand what's the best available data that there's more confidence in through which to evaluate conditions. But then once that determination is made, memorializing that and making that available so that communities can see, what's important, what's around it. And it actually just starts to get better and better and more adaptable.
Great. Dominique, thank you. So Lori, you're going to have the final word on this, and then John, I'm going to come to you for any closing remarks, and then Sylvia to you, and then Stacy to you. Lori, please.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to reiterate, I'm obviously a fan of advancing the technology of remote sensing. I just didn't want it to be tied to a binary yes, no, is this jurisdictional, but the informational and outreach potential of it is invaluable.
Great. Lori, thank you. Okay, great. Well, thank you, everybody. So we're going to end this discussion block here. I'm going to stop my screen sharing if I can remember how to do that. There it is. And then, John, I'm going to turn it over to you. And then right after John, Stacy, I will come to you, Sylvia, and then over to you, Stacy. John.
Thanks very much. I don't have anything really to add. I've said more than enough in my piece. I just wanted to thank all the folks on the webinar today for taking this time and for providing the agencies with a perspective on how they benefit from clean water, how they relate to water resources, and to the agencies for their time and attention to this issue. So thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you, John. Sylvia?
I just want to add my thanks to John's thanks to all of you on the roundtable. You've obviously put a lot of time and thought and effort into this, and I know doing something like this can take time. Everybody's got a lot going on these days, so I really appreciate it. And I want a special shout out to you, John, as well, for playing a key role in organizing this roundtable. I really appreciate your efforts on this. You were the only Northeast region roundtable that we had. That's because you guys put together an outstanding nomination for your roundtable, very diverse, lots of different perspectives and lots of ideas. And we very much appreciate them at EPA. And my guess is that Stacy will say that they appreciated Army as well. The specific examples you gave, the specific ideas, specific stories, that really makes things come alive and is very helpful to us in thinking about how we want to move forward and how we can have these so important Clean Water Act programs be the best that they can be. It's very, very much appreciated. And I think that's basically what I have to say. Again, thank you so much for all your time and effort and your ideas. And I hope that you'll keep thinking about these things and communicating with us on these important issues. Stacy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Sylvia. Yeah, so just echoing everything you said, especially again, coming from Army, comments about implementation are really helpful for us as we move forward on our implementation for the definition. It's good to hear all the different perspectives coming from the regional perspective of the Northeast. Couple of little points too. I just want to say Secretary Connor does have a priority area. He's got 5, but one of them is to strengthen our communication and relationships to solve water resource challenges, with communities and enhance community resiliency. And this kind of roundtable really helps us work towards that. The second piece, I'll do a little plug because it was brought up regarding jurisdictional determinations. And we do have a Federal Register notice out right now, and it does request input on how to incorporate tribal consultation into our approved jurisdictional determination process to ensure we do fulfill our trust responsibilities on that. So I encourage you all, if you're interested, to take a look at our Federal Register notice to modernize civil works. And that is one aspect that we are planning on incorporating into our tribal consultation policy update. With that, I will just say thank you very much for attending and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Meeting adjourned.
Thank you.